turn it over to Dennis.
Thanks a lot, Kathy. I'm Dennis Hetzel, the Headline Books author of Killing the Curse, Season of Lies, and the soon-to-be-released Azalea Bluff, and a recovering journalist, among other things. So hopefully, I know a little bit about interviewing. It's my pleasure today to interview my friend Don Bentley, the author of the just-released Target Acquired. Don spent a decade as an Army Apache helicopter pilot, during which time he was stationed in South Korea, Germany, and Texas, while deployed to Afghanistan as a troop commander in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. He won the Bronze Star Medal and the Air Medal for valor. Following his time in the military, he worked as an FBI special agent, as a member of the Dallas office SWAT team. And since leaving the FBI, he's worked for a number of companies that develop tech for the U.S. Special Operations community. He holds a BS in electrical and computer engineering from The Ohio State University. I know that because I lived in Columbus. And a master in fine arts and writing popular fiction from Seton Hill University. He's also the author of the very well-received Matt Drake thriller series, Without Sanction and The Outside Man, and there's at least 2 more coming, as I understand it. And now Target Acquired, where he's become a member of the Tom Clancy universe, which I guess is sort of like the Marvel universe. So, Don, welcome. And I think maybe the best way to start is talk a little bit about what it's like to get into this Tom Clancy world. It's got to be really exciting and interesting. I'm sure you were always a fan.
Yeah, it really is. And thanks for having me, Dennis. And I'd be remiss if I didn't start by saying congratulations on Azalea Bluff. I got to read an early copy of that, and it was fantastic. I think the book's going to do incredibly well, so I'm excited for you. But
thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. To your point, I think I was about 14 when I read my first Tom Clancy book, and it was Red Storm Rising. And I had, a buddy down the street who was a couple years older than me who raided his dad's book stash, and so he read it and then gave it to me, and he's like, "You got to read this book. It just felt so realistic, so visceral." And so I say that book was, and Tom Clancy in general was kind of my gateway to the thriller genre, my gateway drug, if you will, to all things military thrillers and epic military thrillers. And so, 30 something years later, being offered the opportunity to write in the Clancy universe really is just incredible. And for, folks of mine who aren't Clancy fans yet or don't know it, I said, the only thing I can think that's the equivalent to that is, if you're a screenplay writer and somebody says, "Hey, do you want to write the next Star Wars movie?" And that's really what it felt like to be offered the chance to write in the Clancy universe.
I'm kind of curious. So how did that work? Where, as I understand it from a little bit of research I did, Tom Clancy's family, he passed away some years ago now, still controls kind of what happens. So was it like a competition where you vetted, or what exactly, how does that all unfold?
Yeah, so I'm very fortunate in that the editor that I have for my Matt Drake series, the Without Sanction and The Outside Man, is Tom Colgan. And so Tom, and there's a lot of Toms in this conversation, I apologize up front. Tom Colgan was Tom Clancy's editor for his last couple of books before Tom passed away, and then after Tom passed away, he has been kind of entrusted with Tom's legacy from a literary perspective. And so the first guy, or not the first, one of my friends, Mark Greeny, who writes the Gray Man series and Red Metal and a bunch of other things, he wrote for Tom Clancy when Tom was still alive, and then wrote the first couple of books after Tom died. And Tom Colgan was also his editor and is still his editor for his Gray Man series. And so as you can imagine, there's the Clancy Foundation that controls, everything that Tom Clancy created. And I would have to think in the beginning there was they were kind of feeling each other out, where they rightfully so wanted to make sure that the publisher was going to continue to produce books that were the same quality that Tom wrote, and kind of vice versa, that the publisher wanted to still work with Tom Clancy. And so fast forward, it's been, I think next year will be 10 years since Tom Clancy died, and they have continued to work together since then. And so now it's a much more not collegial relationship, but maybe a much more trusting one, in that when you're asked to write in the Clancy Foundation or the Clancy universe, and I guess I have a buddy who was a member of Delta Force for a long time. He retired as a sergeant major, and he said one of the things they used to say in that organization is you're always in selection. So even after you've made it, you're always in selection. And I feel like that's what it was like writing for my editors. I didn't know it at the time, but I was in selection to potentially join the Tom Clancy universe. And so at the end of my editorial call that we had for The Outside Man, Tom Colgan, my editor, asked me, and he said, "Hey, what would you feel like, or would you be interested in writing in the Tom Clancy universe?" And it was after I picked my jaw back up off the ground, and I thought, yes, I would indeed be interested in writing there. And so that's kind of how it happened. Tom Colgan, in addition to be the editor, he's in charge of going out and finding the right writers to come in, and he does that across a number of series. He does it for the W.E.B. Griffin universe, as well as the Robert Ludlum series and two. And so he's kind of known for being able to go find the right writer for the right series. And so that's how I was able to come into that, is a little bit of writing chops, hopefully, and a whole lot of luck, which I think probably sums up the majority of this business.
I think maybe life in general.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of serendipity. I could go off on a rabbit hole about that. I've read and reviewed both of your Matt Drake books, and they're very good. I just finished Target Acquired literally yesterday on a plane from Dallas, coming back from Dallas to already this, and I do see some similarities between Jack Ryan Jr. and Matt Drake character, but there's also some differences. Maybe talk about that a little bit. How are the characters different, and also how did you kind of put a wall around what you're doing there and kind of get into what that is? I mean, they're both military thrillers, but obviously there's got to be some distinctions.
Yeah, that was one of the things I was most worried about from a couple of different vantage points. And the first one being, I should say that Tom Colgan is an incredible editor to work with, and doubly so for the Clancy stuff, because after he gives you the opportunity and you say yes, he's very protective of his writers, in the standpoint that one of our first conversations is he said to me, he's like, "Look, I don't expect you to try and write like Tom Clancy. Nobody can write like Tom Clancy." And he said, "I picked you because I loved what you did with the Matt Drake series, and I want you to bring that to this universe." And so he said, "The only thing you have to do is write how you normally write. You just write it in Tom's universe using his characters." And so that kind of took a weight off of me as a writer, where I certainly felt a tremendous amount of responsibility to come to this incredible, universe and these iconic characters and do them justice in the manner in which Tom did it, and the things that his readers would expect, but still try to, like I said, kind of bring my take on the characters and the way that I write. And so I did go back and read a number of the early Clancy's that were some of my first books, like Cardinal of the Kremlin and Clear and Present Danger and stuff, because both of those had characters that I thought were going to be important in Target Acquired. And I just wanted to get familiar with them again and understand who they were. Clear and Present Danger was Ding Chavez's origin story. Cardinal of the Kremlin has a lot about Mary Pat Foley in there. And so I wanted to understand them from Tom's perspective when he originally created them, from Tom Clancy's perspective. So that was one of the first things I did. The other thing that kind of helped me as I differentiated between Matt Drake, who's my protagonist for my series, and Jack Ryan Jr. is, from an inside baseball perspective, I write the Matt Drake books as a first-person protagonist writer, and he has a very unique voice. I've said before, it's very heavily influenced by Nelson DeMille's John Corey series, because he also writes a very witty, very voicey first-person protagonist. And so the Jack Ryan Jr. books are all written in third person, and so that helped me somewhat keep the two characters, if you will, separate from a very high level. The other thing that makes Jack Ryan Jr. very compelling, or that there are a number of things that make him very compelling, is that unlike almost any other thriller protagonist that I can think of, Jack Ryan Jr. doesn't have the resume, if you will, to support what he does. So he was never a CIA officer. He never went to the farm to learn how to run and recruit assets. He doesn't have a special operations background. In fact, he never served in the military at all. And the only reason why he's at the campus, which is the, the off the books intelligence paramilitary organization that's at the heart of the Jack Ryan Jr. novels in the first place, is because his name is Jack Ryan and his father's name, is also Jack Ryan, and he's the president of the United States. And so what's interesting about that, and Jack Ryan Jr. has certainly over the course of the 8 books demonstrated why he belongs there, and has had to learn those skills from people, from iconic characters like John Clark, whose origin was in Without Remorse, to Ding Chavez and everybody in between. But he also constantly has that drive that he has something he has to prove, right? He has to prove, if only to himself, that he belongs there, because everybody else, I served in the Army for 10 years. And when infantry officers, after they graduate from the infantry officer basic course, they go to Ranger School, and that's a rite of passage for infantry officers. And so when you walk in the room as an infantry officer, you have a Ranger tab, and everybody can look at that and say, yes, he belongs, or now she belongs too. Jack Ryan Jr. doesn't have any of that. And so he's constantly proving that he should be there. And so that makes him a very compelling character. The other thing that makes him very compelling, that also I think helped me keep him separate from Matt, is this notion that, he's now in his mid-30s. And most of us, grow up worshiping our father, right? When we're little boys, our father's Superman. By the time we're teenagers, he suddenly isn't as smart as he used to be. And then usually by the time we're in our 20s, dad suddenly has gotten brilliant again, right? But
maybe he didn't know what he was talking about.
Yes, exactly. And I'm waiting for my son to get to that point. He's still somewhere in between there.
And they will, they do.
Yes, sooner or later. But I think even with that, right, eventually you see your father as a person, as just a flesh and blood person. With Jack Ryan Jr.'s father, he is larger than life. And even 30 something years old, you're in the shadow of this man who is the iconic American statesman and frankly superhero. And so there were a whole lot of things that made him very compelling as a character that helped me keep them separate. That said, there was probably some bleed over in so much as one of the scenes in Target Acquired, Jack Ryan Jr. is calling back to talk to John Clark, who is his boss at the campus. And he says things with a tone of voice that maybe is a little bit snippier than the situation warrants. And so Tom Colgan, my editor, serves as kind of the guardrails for the series. And he came down and smote me like lightning from above and said, Jack Ryan Jr. would never talk to John Clark that way. That's your character. And so I dutifully removed most of it and did that. But it is, it's hard when you're trying to bring your same energy and the stuff folks hopefully like from your series to these iconic characters. There's bound to be some bleed over in there, and that's what a good editor helps you sort through.
You've raised a bunch of stuff I want to ask about. I know when having read, your first 2 books and this one,
sure,
I kind of felt like Jack Ryan Jr. is more like John Clark, very action oriented.
Yep.
He thinks a little bit, but then he moves, where Matt Drake is actually a little bit more like Jack Ryan Sr., a little more contemplative and inner focused. I don't know if you agree with that, but
I'll take it. I certainly, I'll take it. No, that is a good point, because that was something I played with a little bit in Target Acquired, is that Jack Ryan Jr. had the reputation for being impetuous, right? Of going out and say, I'm going to act first and sometimes think about what I'm going to do later. And I was able to tease that out a little bit in Target Acquired, because there is a scene that there's kind of mentioned before where he's got to go off the reservation a little bit, and he's trying to get John Clark to trust him to do that, to say, hey, I've matured as a person. I've matured as an operator. I'm not that headstrong kid anymore that originally, came in, however many years ago. And so I need you to trust me that I'm going to do the right thing here. And it was, like I said, that's one of the awesome things about writing in these series, is that you have these incredible writers like Mark Madden and Mark Graney and Mark Cameron that helped shape this. And so there's so much that you can draw on in these awesome things they've done over the arc of the series that I could take advantage of.
Yeah, and this is more of a, I would call it kind of a straight ahead military.
Yeah.
Versus there's not a lot of snide remarks about politicians and bureaucrats, but it doesn't, which is well deserved almost all often, so the former lobbyist. But it's really a kind of a straight ahead war thriller, and he almost has kind of mythic heroic qualities. And I found myself thinking, and it's a great story. I found myself thinking interesting to see how he develops as a person in the coming stories.
Yeah.
I guess I should take a step back and say, you know, for the folks who aren't familiar with the basic plot, talk a little bit about what Target Acquired is about.
Yeah. So when my editor gave me the chance to write it, we brainstormed for a bit on plots and what we would do. And this is another aspect in which Tom Clancy is the guardrail of the series, because he knows what's been done before. He knows, you know, an encyclopedic kind of knowledge of what the other books have happened. And so part of what I wanted to do, especially because it was my first time writing, and I felt like my job was to crawl inside Jack Ryan Jr.'s head and understand him at a very visceral level, is what I kind of pitched for this book. And what you see in Target Acquired is two things. And so the first being that it focuses almost exclusively just on Jack Ryan Jr. and not some of the other iconic characters. And the reason why I did that is I kind of likened it a little bit to an Avengers movie, in that when you have all these superheroes together trying to share screen time, you get a little bit of each of your favorite characters, but you don't get that deep dive into Robert Downey Jr. that you do in Iron Man. And so that's what I really wanted to do, is kind of have that deep dive there. And then the second thing that I used to frame the book a little bit is my editor was telling me about a conversation he had with Mark Cameron, who writes the Jack Ryan Sr. books, in which because Mark does a fantastic job, but he has a really hard job because his protagonist is president of the United States. And so it's hard often to come up with a problem that the president can't solve just by the nature of him being the president and having these vast resources to call upon. And so during one of their wargaming sessions, Mark said, hey, what if we came up with a scenario where everything that Jack Ryan Sr. normally enjoys is taken from him, that the very fact that he's the president becomes a hindrance rather than a help to this story. And so that seemed really, really interesting to me. And so I grabbed hold of that and said, you know, what if I could come up with a scenario where the same thing's true about Jack Ryan Jr. With his relationship to the campus, so that normally when he gets into trouble, he can call back to John Clark, who's his boss, and bring the campus folks in and all of the assets and resources associated with that. What if we came up with a scenario that none of that is available to him, and he literally has to survive off his own wits and his own skill set? And so that was kind of the bounding of the story. And then from a very tactical perspective, you know, the first question is, where's the book set? And it's set in Tel Aviv, Israel. And that's one of the amazing parts of being a writer, is that you get to set the book wherever you want. And so Tel Aviv is one of my favorite cities in the world. After I got out of the FBI, for the next 9 or so years, I worked, like you said in the intro, kind of with companies that were marketing or developing technology for primarily customers in the special operations community. And so I got to work with a number of Israeli companies because of that. And so I've been to Tel Aviv several times before, a number of close friends who were Israeli. It's a fantastic city. The Israelis, like Americans, they speak great English. The food there is incredible. So I said, all right, I know what it's going to be. I know where it's going to be. Now I just got to figure out what in the world's going to happen. And so the other thing I wanted to do is take something that was kind of benign and have that spin out of control, if you will, and drive the rest of the story. And so what I settled on in the opening scene of Target Acquired is what's called an asset validation exercise. And so there was, in my former life, when I was an FBI special agent, I was what's called a human intelligence person. And so my job was to run and recruit what we call sources, or what folks in the intelligence community call assets, And so what you're trying to do is find somebody who has information to questions that you need answered. And those questions could be very tactical, like how are the drugs moving through this particular organization, or very strategic, like what is, what are the aims of the North Korean WMD program? And so when you go and find someone who has information that you want, or answers to those questions, you still have to look at them and vet them from the perspective of, unlike you, who, if you're an FBI agent, you went to Quantico and the FBI Academy to learn how to do this, or if you're a CIA or DIA case officer, you went to the farm. The asset doesn't have any training on how to be an asset, how to do things like collect the information and furnish it to you without potentially compromising themselves or you. And so one of the things you can do to say, are they trainable, is you craft this scenario that's called an asset validation exercise, where you give them a tasking that they think is real, but it's all very controlled. And what you're doing is using that as safeguards to evaluate them and say, are they capable of doing what I need to do when the stakes aren't high or life-threatening? And so when the book opens, Jack Ryan Jr. is participating in an asset validation exercise in Tel Aviv. And as he's doing it, he sees a woman and her child who kind of enter the stage from next to him. And behind the woman, he sees a man that's coming after her with a knife. And so Jack Ryan Jr. does what he does. He's a sheepdog. He protects the sheep, and he interdicts the man. And from there, kind of the story spirals into Jack trying to figure out who is tracking or targeting the woman and why, before the woman inadvertently unleashes the apocalypse. So again, like most Tom Clancy stories, very small stakes. The only thing at stake right here is the end of the world, and that's what he's trying to prevent.
Just that.
Just small potatoes.
I have a couple questions I'd love to ask you about the woman, but they'd be spoiler alerts, so I'm not gonna do it. There is a scene in the movie, or in the book, excuse me, about and I know your pilot training, I'm sure helped, and I'm sure you know about pilots, where I think we've talked about this before, about what's possible and impossible in writing fiction. There's some and again, I don't want to be a spoiler, but there's a section where this pilot is going through some incredible aeronautical acrobatics in order to stop an attack. I'll just leave it at that. Is that all possible, that you can do everything you said that this pilot was doing? Was it an F-15 or an F-35? I'm trying to...
F-35. Yeah, there's a sequence in there with an F-35 pilot, and I knew I took it from one of my favorite aspects of the Battle of Britain in World War II, and so I knew kind of what I wanted to do, but as a helicopter pilot, I knew it was way outside my expertise. And so fortunately, I have a friend who I first met again when I was in middle school at 13 or 14, who went to the Air Force Academy and flew F-16s for 20 something years before retiring. And so he still flies in actually for an organization called the Mission Aviation Fellowship in Haiti. He flies into very rough airfields and remote parts of the country and stuff. And so I wrote up the sequence. That was my first take at it. And I said, "Hey, Eric, have I got something for you to look at?" And so he was kind enough to read through it and offer suggestions. And then I did a bunch of research on the F-35 on my own, because I knew that I wanted it to star in this sequence. And it's such a fascinating airplane. And that was, again, like when I wrote down my list of stuff, I told you I wrote read a bunch of early Tom Clancy books. I kept notes that I titled, something profound called like "Cool Stuff Clancy Does." And when one of the things that I think is a cool thing Tom Clancy did was putting you in the cockpit or on the bridge or like right there in the thick of things. And so I knew I wanted to have this sequence. And I got the smartest guy I could to help talk me through what I was trying to do and figure if it was possible. So to answer your question, is it possible? It's as close to possible as I could get it. How about that?
That's great. It's a great sequence. That alone is worth the price of admission for the book. So what have you heard from, I'm sure Clancy there must be like people who are just like so totally into Tom Clancy and everything in the universe. What kind of feedback have you had, positive and negative? Is there anybody who said, no, wait a minute, Jack Ryan Jr. wouldn't be this dude, or has it all been good?
There is a large, I shouldn't say large collection, maybe just vocal folks who take every opportunity to remind you that Tom Clancy is in fact dead, and that this book was not written by Tom Clancy, which just befuddles me because, again, I liken it back to the Star Wars movies or Star Wars books, frankly. George Lucas's name is on all of those, but what he did was bring in writers that could take his universe and his characters and kind of expound those. And so a number of those who felt it was their duty to let me know that Tom did not, in fact, write the book that has his name on it. But those were pretty small. The majority of folks who have responded have been very, very complimentary. I love the books, or I love the comments I get that said, I only got 2 hours of sleep last night because of, or I only intended to read a chapter, and those are really fun. And it's actually been kind of cool too, to see folks who read my books before and then came to Tom Clancy and said, hey, I can see your influence in here. I love that you're doing this series because you bring something that's a little bit different. It's more of what you've done before. And then at the same token, folks who, I got an email today from somebody saying they love the book and they were going to go get my 2 books now because of it. So it's been really, really fun. And it's just been, first of all, I feel incredibly lucky to even do this with my book series, but then to be able to do it with his, and just knowing that there's such high expectations for readers there, and so many people still, love and care about the Clancy universe and these Clancy characters, that it's just been really, really fun.
Well, I noticed today when I was prepping, you were #1 in war fiction today on Amazon. So congratulations.
Thank you.
And then I noticed you had Scott Brick, like the GOAT audiobook narrator.
Yeah.
So that had to be a thrill, I would think, just to work with someone like Scott Brick.
Yeah, I was on vacation, quote unquote vacation, last week. I was actually doing press and interviews and stuff for most of it. But during the downtime, I downloaded the audiobook, and I would just sit at the pool and listen to him read the book. And man, does he make you sound like a better writer. Like you just get, he's such a good actor and such a good reader that you get, even though I knew what was coming, I was starting to get carried away. And as a writer, usually by the time your book comes out, you've read that thing so many stinking times that you can't even tolerate it. Like you read a page and you're like, I can't. But when he's reading it, man, I would listen to that guy read a grocery list. Like he is amazing.
Yeah, we've got a really good female reader for Azalea Bluff, which is going to be the first one I've done that's going to have an audiobook. And I'm really excited. And we have a female protagonist, and it's so cool to hear your words come to life and how someone else, interprets them. Yep. And I was going to say, to an earlier comment, there is no greater compliment than I didn't go to bed last night, or I only got 2 hours of sleep. But also, I always found you could have something that's just sort of an offhand comment that you didn't even think that much about while you were writing that page or that chapter, and someone will come up and tell you how much that paragraph, that sentence meant to them.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Just something about it just connected, and I think that's one of the rewards too.
Absolutely. So I'm so glad that COVID seems to be getting behind us, because man, doing the virtual stuff is great, but it does not compare to actually getting to meet readers face to face. And like I said, I haven't been a published author for that long. Without Sanction just came out a year ago, and thankfully I got to do about half of my book tour there before COVID shut it down. But it's a surreal feeling when you're, especially, I wrote for 17 years and 3 books that got nowhere. And then to be at the point where you have complete strangers that are talking to you about your book is a surreal feeling, and frankly, one of the best ones in the world at the same time.
Right. You're an overnight success after only 17 years. Kind of like the musician who, has this hit, and you go, well, I've been playing in bars for 10 years.
Exactly right. That's what I kid all the time. I'm like, if you discount the 3 novels that didn't sell in the 17 years it took me to write them, I'm an overnight success. So,
So what came first for you? Did you always want to write? Was it kind of always in your DNA? And obviously we all thank you for your service in the
oh,
military. But is
yeah.
this something that came later after you did your military service?
No, as long as I can remember, like I remember telling myself stories as a kid before I fell asleep at night, just telling myself stories. And I remember I think it was 3rd or 4th grade, actually writing some Star Trek fan fiction where you would, I would watch the old reruns with my dad and then go into my room and write different endings for them or variations on them. And I think that certainly continued. And when I was in middle school, and I loved writing. I had my senior year in high school, my AP English teacher actually took me aside at one point, and we had our job was to write a scene or something. And she said, "This is really good. Like, I think you could do this professionally. You should keep at it." And so I took her advice to heart and went into The Ohio State University and majored in electrical engineering, as good writers do. And so it did. It certainly took a while for me to figure out. I always had the urge to tell stories, but there were things about the mechanics of a novel that I didn't understand yet. And so about 2001 or so, I took some classes from Writer's Digest and started to understand more about kind of the pieces I was missing. And that's when I wrote my first novel, and then wrote another novel, partly when I was deployed to Afghanistan, and then mostly when I came back. And then when that didn't sell, I thought that there were probably some more things about my craft I still needed to learn. And so Seton Hill University has this great low residency MFA program that is unabashedly genre focused. And so you go there and your mentor is somebody who writes in the genre that you want to be published. And so I wrote my 3rd book there, and that's the first time Matt made his appearance. I was kind of still fleshing him out as protagonist, and then that didn't sell either. And so it really is, when folks ask about writing advice or what my writing advice, other than saying don't sulk as long as I did, because then you won't spend 17 years trying to write the book that actually sells, is writing, I think, is equal parts perseverance, because you certainly have to write the book or it's never going to get sold, but also figuring out a way to get better at your craft, right? Because if you just write the same book over and over again without getting better, it's kind of the definition of insanity, right? And so those two things have to go together, and neither of them are particularly easy to do, I think.
I think, I've had the opportunity to, review and meet a number of authors with military backgrounds, which I don't have. My dad served in World War II, but I didn't. And I have to think, besides giving you great experiences and settings for your stories, that military background, that stick-to-itiveness, that failure is not an option. I mean, these all seem like cliches, but the reason they're cliches is because there's truth to it. I have to think that perseverance, I have an objective, that training that successful military people just exude had to have helped.
Yeah, definitely does. I mean, you don't get the option to call in sick or to quit when you're in the military. And so it certainly gives you that discipline is foundational, I think, to being a good writer, frankly, is because you have to spend the time in the chair every day, right? Writing. I think the second part, especially for folks who write in this genre, is the way the military is set up at the battalion level. Is there are staff officers that do staff functions. And so 2 of the prominent ones, one is called the S3, which is the operations officer. And so he or she is doctrinally responsible for coming up with a plan that you're going to execute, right? We're going to go do a zone reconnaissance. Here are the routes we're going to fly. Here are the target reference points. Here's what we're looking for. His or her counterpart is an officer that's called the S2, which is the intelligence officer. And so the intelligence officer's job is to put him or her to put themselves in the enemy's place. And so when you do, like before you do an operation, you do what's called a map drill, where there'll literally be a terrain board that they've made that looks like the area you're going to operate in. And the S3 talks through the friendly plan And the S2 talks through the enemy plan. Like, here's how the enemy has his forces arrayed. Here's what they're going to do. When you move here, I'm going to do this. When this happens. And so most of us have spent some time, most of the military officers, in that role, either, in school, in the actual battalion. And so what that gives you the ability to do is look at the world around us and predict what bad guys are going to do. Like, to think like a bad guy or think like a particular threat, and then incorporate that into our books. And so, I've heard people say before, Brad Taylor's a friend of mine. He's a fantastic writer. And I've heard folks say, well, he predicts the future, and I was like, I don't know that he does that as much as what he does is he looks at the world and then uses the training that he's given to say, if I were the Chinese, what would I do next in this situation? And lo and behold, the Chinese actually do that. And that's because of the military training that he's received. And I think that's a huge benefit for those of us who have had the opportunity to serve.
You're kind of looking at the world the way it is, not the way you wish it was.
Exactly right.
Because that could be fatal, right?
Exactly right. Exactly right.
So what's next for Jack Ryan Jr. and who plays him in the movie?
That's a good question. I think when folks who aren't readers of this series, it can get a little confusing between Jack Ryan Sr. and Jack Ryan Jr. and how old he is. And so one of my two favorite Jack Ryans are Alec Baldwin in Hunt for the Red October.
Oh.
And
maybe one of the best movies ever, has to be.
Yeah, it's so good with Sean Connery. It's just so good. And then the second Jack Ryan I really like, and I always get his last name wrong, but John, it's Krasinski or Krasinski.
John Krasinski,
yeah, who plays right now in the Amazon series. And so what I tell folks is that he is the same age in the Amazon series as my character is, my Jack Ryan Jr. character is in the books. And so I think even though it would confuse the daylights out of everybody, I think he would make a fantastic Jack Ryan Jr. as well.
So what's next for him for you? Are you already working on another one, or?
Yeah, so right now I'm working on Hostile Intent, which is the third book in my Matt Drake series. And so that will be due to my publisher in exactly a month from today, which is a little bit terrifying, to be honest with you. And so once that happens, I'll dive into the next Jack Ryan Jr. book. So I'm supposed to later on this week have a call with my editor, Tom Colgan, to talk arcs and what we want to do with the next book and what my ideas are. And he's super, super gracious about this, because going full circle back to what you asked about the Clancy Foundation, what you have to do right now is write kind of a 4-page synopsis that you give to them and they approve it. And so when he told me that, I said, I write very organically. And so I have a general idea of what I'm going to do, but I don't know. And he's like, no, that's fine. Just write it. And so I wrote the synopsis and they said, yep, that sounds good. And so fast forward a year until, back in December, right before I turned the book in, my editor came to me and he said, hey, the publisher in the UK does their own book cover. It's separate from ours. And so what we normally do is send them that 4-page synopsis. And so I know that you've probably strayed a little bit from that. So if you could just look at it and tell me, of those 4 pages, how much of it is still relevant, and I'll send him that. And I said, yeah, sure. And so I pulled it up and then I got back with him. I said, Tom, about the first paragraph is still relevant. The else is completely changed. And so I say that to say, we'll talk sometime this week about what the next book should look like for Jack Ryan Jr., but I won't know what it is until we turn it in, to be truthful with you. So we'll see.
You write a little bit like I do. I mean, some writers, you can tell, sort of outline everything.
Mm-hmm.
And that's great for having a good tight plot. Others just sort of start with a germ of an idea. My writing, it's more like improvisational jazz. Is I have a theme, but it's going to go off on riffs I can't predict.
I've heard Lee Child say once there are great writers that outline ahead of time. I mean, Kyle Mills, that took over the Vince Flynn series, he's famous for talking about, I hope he doesn't do it with all of his books, but for one of the books, he did a 42,000 word outline before he ever wrote the book. But I remember being at Thriller Fest and hearing somebody ask Lee Child, about, hey, do you outline beforehand? And he's like, why in the world would I want to know how the story turns out before I even write it? And he's like, that'd be boring. I'd never write the book. And I'm like, what he said. But he obviously does it quite a bit better than I do. So we'll see.
Well, what happens too, I find, is characters take on lives of their own, and you're
Sure.
in the story, and oh, I could do that. You know, you're kind of omniscient. It's just more fun to do this versus what I was going to do.
It does, for sure.
Yeah.
And there have been there's a character in Target Acquired who was a minor character the first draft, or I envisioned her being a very minor character, and she over subsequent drafts turned into a very major one, which is cool to see when that happens. But the alternative to that is there's been more than one case, because I'll typically take like note cards and plot out the book after I've done the first draft and lay it all on the dining room table and try and figure out how it goes together. And there's been more than one occasion where my wife's come in and I've kind of had my head in my hands and the cards scattered everywhere. And I'm like, I don't know how this book is ever going to come together. So one way or the other. Yeah, it always does.
You have to wait for the epiphany.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think the all-time great example of that, it comes from television, is Breaking Bad, from what I've read, you know, which is so brilliant. They didn't plan on Jesse being an important character.
I didn't know that.
And yet the story arcs of Jesse and Walt are what make, I mean, they go in opposite directions. That's what makes that so powerful. And they didn't know, really understand what they had till they saw how he played that role. So that's awesome. Part of the fun.
Yeah.
So you're not quite sure where Jack Ryan Jr. is going to be in the next book yet.
I imagine wherever he is going to be, he will get into trouble. That's what I can promise you. Things will not go well for him.
I kept thinking he'd be like the world's most valuable hostage, you know, as the president. So that's something they all have to be conscious of at the campus, I guess, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, Don, we're at about the 45-minute mark, so I think I'm going to let you get on with your day, since you need to sounds like you're on a deadline. You have a lot of writing to do.
Only 30 days. I mean, I got plenty of time.
You know, about 3,000 or 4,000 words a day.
Exactly.
But this has been a lot of fun, as always, and I'm sure the book's generally available, but just tell people how they can go about getting Target.
Yes,
I'll hold it up since I have to.
Oh, thank you. Yes, good lead in. So available anywhere where books are sold, and you can, if you go to my website, which is donbentley.books.com, just DONBENTLEY books.com, there's links to Target Acquired as well as my Matt Drake series. And if you go there, you can sign up for my newsletter, and that's where we do giveaways and cover reveals and everything else. So that's probably the best place to go, both to buy the book or to figure out more about me or either of my series.
Thanks again. This has been a great 45 minutes with my friend Don Bentley. I'm Dennis Hetzel, Headline Books author, and this has been Zoom into Books. Thanks again, Don.
Thanks for having me, Dennis.